It's always a mistake to try to fit into a pre-existing box. Just follow whatever it is sitting in your head. If you feel like there's just something that has to come out, then you know you're on the right track. And I can remember he was telling me this at a time when I told him there was a certain type of story I wanted to do, semi-autobiographical, and I was a little embarrassed. I was a little afraid that if I did it, people would put two and two together and say, "Oh, so you did A, B, and C," and then make fun of me for it. And he said, "No, no, that is exactly what you should do. Just dive into the pool. The water's fine." He goes, "Everybody will follow you. They won't make fun of you. They'll see what you did and say, 'Oh, I did that.'"
Welcome to The Creative Asylum, a weekly podcast that digs deep into the minds of visionary creators of all stripes. Musicians, actors, filmmakers, writers, artists, cartoonists, and cultural disruptors. Here, we'll discuss perspectives of living life on your own terms. Life lessons that keep us grounded, insane, and sometimes pull us back from the edge. So, take a deep breath, loosen your grip on the bland and the boring. This is your weekly prescription for authentic living, creative clarity, and hopefully, a little bit of cultural rebellion.
Side effects may include spontaneous joy, existential epiphanies, and an uncontrollable urge to do weird and beautiful things.
Welcome to the Creative Asylum. As always, I am your host, Daniel House. Today's guest is the first conversation we've had with a cartoonist, the Seattle-based Peter Bagge. I'm really excited to have him because I have a whole background myself as a comics enthusiast, originally with Marvel and then with Underground Comics, and then in the 80s and 90s with a lot of the independent publishers. I first became a fan of Peter Bagge somewhere around 1987 with his series Neat Stuff. And then we first met while I was working at Sub Pop, and he was commissioned to do a piece for a 45 we did for Tad. If you know Tad, he's very heavy and rather awesome. After that, I became an even bigger fan with his series called Hate on Fantagraphics. That ran for about 30 issues or so. But in the decades since, he's been incredibly active. He's done work with Marvel, with DC, with Dark Horse, and for a stint, he even did work with the legendary Mad Magazine. Anyway, this is a great conversation. It's great to have him on the Creative Asylum, and I hope you enjoyed as much as I enjoyed talking to him. So here we go. Peter Bagge.
All right.
Alrighty.
Hello, Peter Bagge. How are
Hi,
you,
how you
sir?
doing, Danny? I'm fine.
I'm excited to have you taking part in this podcast. I've whether you know it or not, I've been a fan of your work since the 80s.
Sure, I remember meeting you a number of times way back when.
Yeah, I think we probably met at Sub Pop because I was working there when you did the artwork for that Tad single and also for the Mad Daddies single. And I'm not sure if you did other work for Sub Pop as well, but I remember those two.
Yeah, I did two things for Tad.
Okay. And then also, I was a fan of Neat Stuff before you were doing Hate.
We go back.
Yeah, we go back, and it's actually really fun for me to have a cartoonist on here because over time I wanted to have more and more creatives of, I don't want just to have musicians here.
Okay.
Not that I don't like musicians, but
Right.
I've always kind of thought of your work in that time and place in Seattle as being kind of very much part of the fabric of everything that was going on. Well, how did you first come to Seattle? Because I know you're not from there originally, correct?
No, I'm a New York native.
Okay.
It was 1984. My wife and I, at that point, we decided we really wanted to move. We still wanted to be in a city. We're urbanites, but we wanted to live somewhere more affordable, some place where we could afford a house, afford that wasn't in the suburbs. So we
Okay.
visited Seattle. My wife's sister was living here. We visited them. The two of them decided to start a New York style deli out here. Her sister missed New York food, her sister and her husband. So
Okay.
we loved the city and out we came. Now, again, that was the middle of 1984.
I was going to say it's not affordable anymore.
No, no, it's not the same. Sorry. The cat walking around.
Hello, kitty cat. And at this point, you hadn't connected with Fantagraphics at that point, correct?
I had, and they were still, back then, Fantagraphics was based in Connecticut. And I met them in Connecticut, but we both had plans to move. First they moved to California before they moved up to Seattle. Because we moved to Seattle, my wife and I, we loved it. They moved to Southern California and they hated it. So they followed me up here more or less. And they've been up here ever since.
You can take credit for that.
Yes, I do. And no regrets. We really loved living out here. Of course, I'm not in Seattle anymore. Like you said earlier,
Right.
I joined that wave of people who relocated to Tacoma. 'Cause Tacoma feels like Seattle did 30 years ago,
Right.
cheaper,
Right.
slower, quieter. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I lived in LA for a long time and now live in San Diego, and sort of that way. It's not cheaper, but it's a little slower pace, and I prefer that.
I love San Diego. I think that's a wonderful city. I really love it
It's
there.
a good city.
I know, and just like Seattle, it got crazy expensive, but what are you gonna do?
Yeah. Oh, no, it's nuts. Everything's nuts right now. The entire West Coast is nuts. It's lost its mind. Well, I just recently watched a piece you did. It was basically just, I guess, a speech in, I think it was Spain. I learned a lot about you that I didn't know in terms of everything you've done kind of after Hate, because I think Hate is probably where I was most, a fan of your work. And I think at some point I kind of lost track, and maybe my life just went off track and I stopped buying as many comic books. But first of all, I want to say that I think Hate is the perfect title for a comic book.
Oh, good. Well, thank you.
I love it, and I think one of the things I just love so much about your work is, I think you and I are just a few years apart in age, and I think you and I have a lot of the same influences. I grew up in the Bay Area, in Berkeley and San Francisco, and so as a pretty young kid, like 7, 8 years old, I was very inappropriately reading the wrong comic books. I was basically already at like age 7, 8, completely into Robert Crumb and reading Zap and reading the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, and basically everything that was coming out of like Last Gasp and all of the undergrounds in the Bay Area at that time. And those are really huge. Crumb is still to this day, I think, one of the most important comic artists of the last 100 years, or at least the last 50 years.
Yeah, sure. No, he's my favorite artist. I was like in middle school when I first saw Robert Crumb's artwork. Immediately loved it. I just thought it was perfect. The same with
Yeah.
Gilbert Shelton. The first time I saw some artwork by him, I just loved it. And both me and my older brother were like, "This is the type of work we want to do." We were both still afraid of S. Clay Wilson's comics. They were so
Yeah.
raunchy that was even too much for us. But yeah, I mean, as a kid, I was mostly inspired by the funnier comics in the newspaper, Peanuts and Beetle Bailey and things
Hmm.
like that, and then Mad Magazine. But when I discovered underground comics, that's when I knew exactly what kind of comic I wanted to do. And then I found out the hard way there was no money in it, but stuck with that anyway.
One of the themes of this whole project is kind of revolves around people who pursue their love of whatever the creative thing is, in spite of the fact that it invariably is not a great way to make money. So, it says a lot about people's priorities, I suppose, that
Right.
doing the creative thing is more important, and the money can follow later. And I
Right.
think that's really critical.
Well, that was probably the best advice I'd ever gotten, and it came from Robert Crumb, where he said, "It's always a mistake to try to fit into a pre-existing box.
Hmm.
Just follow whatever it is sitting in your head. If you feel like there's just something that has to come out, then you know you're on the right track."
Hmm.
And I can remember he was telling me this at a time when I told him there was a certain type of story I wanted to do, semi-autobiographical, and I was a little embarrassed. I was a little afraid that if I did it, people would put two and two together and say, "Oh, so you did A, B, and C," and then make fun of me for it. And he said, "No, no, that is exactly what you should do. Just dive into the pool. The water's fine." He goes, "Everybody will follow you. They won't make fun of you. They'll see what you did and say, 'Oh, I did that. I relate to this.'" And that's exactly what happened. That is exactly what happened, where the stuff I was afraid to do is what I should have done. And again, it's just following your own muse. It's always the way to go. It's the best way to go. Prior to that, I would try with no success to bend my work into some pre-existing market, and it just pleased nobody. I wasn't happy with the results. The people whose asses I was trying to kiss, it didn't please them. There was always somebody else doing it better. there really was no point in trying to fit into a pre-existing box.
I think Crumb himself followed a similar path, you
Oh,
know?
yes.
I mean, everything he's best known for is sort of this pouring out of his own id, right? It's just like, here it is on the paper. And you know, if anything, he doesn't get mocked, but he might get criticized. And yet it's so purely honest that, you
Right.
know, and he does. He says the things that other people only think.
Yes, and he did something that was even, he was when he started doing his own, LSD-inspired underground comics, there was nothing like it. He was pretty much inventing something and really exposing even the worst or the most unsavory aspects of his
Yes.
personality. He was just laying it all out there,
Yeah.
like Lenny Bruce style.
Right.
And but it was kind of a risk for him because he actually was doing quite well as a commercial artist. He was doing greeting cards, and he could have kept doing that. He's an excellent artist. Almost everybody is drawn to his drawing style, but he just knew he couldn't always be doing that. He would go nuts if he kept doing that. So he
Right.
had to follow this other path, which again was at great risk. He risked getting arrested, but it wound up being, to the benefit of him and the countless people, including me, who followed him, more or less in his footsteps.
Well, I think in your own way, I think a lot of what you do is it reminds me of Crumb. Like when I'm reading it, I don't feel like I'm looking at an imitation, but I feel like there's a certain spirit there that is there's just something about the uniqueness that is you that I think when I first saw it, what I recognized is something that felt familiar, and I think that
Right.
familiarity was probably Crumb. You know,
It's a
honestly.
especially, lots of times when I'm reading the dialogue between 2 characters, especially between a man and a woman in one of my comics, it will remind me so much of when Robert Crumb and his late wife, Aileen Kaminsky Crumb, when they would do comics together. That pattern, the way they would talk to each other, lots of times I feel like my dialogue echoes that. But I
Hmm.
also feel that way when I read, old Peanuts comics, especially the dialogue between Lucy and Linus. I will think, "Oh, I kinda ripped that off." Not intentionally, but it just became so part of my DNA. The other thing too, this is like it sounds like it's from left field, but I get that same feeling too when I watch a rerun of All in the Family. The dialogue in All in the Family, I'm like, "Oh my god, this totally soaked into my DNA." Maybe everybody on All in the Family were just simply too much like my own family. They had the same working class New York accents. Just the pattern, just the
Yeah.
dialogue reminds me so much of my own dialogue in my own comics.
Which at the time felt so sort of radical in its honesty, you know?
Yeah,
Funny you mention that because I have actually for the last year or so, I've been rewatching the entire All in the Family run, and I just finished season 4,
right.
and I'm just astounded at how
It's shocking all over again, you
it
know?
is, and it still feels as fresh and relevant and pertinent as it ever did, you
Right,
know?
it's like a punch in the face,
Mhm.
or a slap in the face. And again, everybody involved with that show too also took an insane risk because there was just nothing like of course, the public was more than ready for something like that, but, nobody knew that for a fact, you
So
know?
you do you feel that you took a similar risk in just in taking Robert Crumb's advice and just kind of
Well, yes, but I trusted him, and at the time too, I was not making much money. My wife was the big breadwinner back then. I was
Uh-huh.
just squeaking by. So when financially I had nothing to lose. It's either that or just get some boring day job.
Sure.
So I might as well take risks and follow my muse. And eventually it paid off.
Was the risk with neat stuff, or was it with hate, or was it even before any of them?
During Neat Stuff. With Neat Stuff, it was like a one-man anthology. I was doing all different types of characters, all different cartoon characters,
Right.
different storylines, and one of them was like the Bradley family, and one of the characters in the Bradley family was Buddy Bradley, and not surprisingly, he was the character I related to the most. So I kept imbuing him with things that I had done and said and seen. So it was mainly him, doing stories with him and how deep I wanted to go with him. And that was the one thing that really paid off. So then, of course, he wound up just in my own mind, he wound up taking over, and so with Hate, I just made him the star of the whole comic book. I made the comic almost completely revolve around him.
It was a natural progression.
Yes.
How did you choose the name Buddy Bradley?
Laziness. It was, well, my it was well, I like generic names. I like
Uh-huh.
literal names for the first name and the last name both start with the same letter, like Lisa Leavenworth is his girlfriend. There's a bit of like in Superman comics, there's so Lex Luthor, Lois
Lois
Lane,
Lane, Lex
Bela,
Luthor, yeah, yeah.
Reynolds. Yes. And also when the very first time I drew a Bradley family comic, it was a satire of my own family. It was
Right.
basically I was just showing the dysfunction of my own family, but presenting it like it was the Brady Bunch,
Mhm.
acting like, "Look at this lovable old American family," while they weren't anything but. Came up with the name Bradley because it's like my name's Bag, but Bradley is much more generic, more common. And then again, just to be cute, I gave every single person in the family a name that starts with a B. Mainly nicknames, but, you know, thought that was cute and easy to remember. So,
It worked. It absolutely
yeah.
worked. So, one thing I was really fascinated to find out that I hadn't known is that you took over from Robert Crumb at some point, becoming the managing editor for Weirdo, which
Yes.
I don't know how I missed that. I probably just was too busy reading the comics and not the credits. But tell me about that experience because that just seems kind of awesome.
I started getting published starting around 1980 with the type of work I was doing. It's funny, the only people that would publish anything by me would be like underground publications like the East Village Eye
Right.
or High Times Magazine or porno magazines like Screw Magazine. Those were my clients.
Whatever pays the bills.
Yes, none of them were gonna give me the space to do longer stories.
Uh-huh.
So I combined forces with a bunch of like-minded cartoonists, and we started self-publishing.
Right.
We published something called Comical Funnies. It was just this comic tabloid. Then around that same time, Robert Crumb started doing Weirdo Magazine, and so it had his work and along with other people's work.
Right.
I was shocked to see it had an address. I was like, "Oh my gosh, I can write to him directly." Got so excited, sent him the comics that me and my friends were doing. He liked them. We started a correspondence. Then after a while, he decided he wanted help editing. He wanted like a managing editor for Weirdo, mainly somebody who would reject all these people's work, which is always going to be most of it. He asked me if I wanted the job, and I said, sure. And, a job in quotes, it paid horribly,
Sure.
but it was a great opportunity to work with him, and it elevated my name a bit. This would have been even before I was doing neat stuff. This would have been starting around 1983. And after a while, having my own comic book was taking up so much of my time that I had to quit, which he wasn't happy about. But after editing 9 or so issues, I had to quit doing Weirdo. Although I really cherished that whole experience. He was such a great mentor, always gave me nothing but good advice.
Are you guys still in touch?
Not too much. He moved to France a long time ago, and then last time I saw him or communicated with him in any way was 7 or 8 years ago at Columbia University, of all places. They had a big celebration of Weirdo Magazine. So it was
Oh,
me
that's
and
fun.
Robert Crumb's wife, Eileen Crumb. She took over as the editor when I quit.
Okay.
So it was the three of us and the artist Drew Friedman, and just talked to a room full of people about Weirdo.
So I assume you probably made a lot of connections to people you're still in touch with today through that experience of being part of Weirdo?
Yeah, pretty much. As time goes by, I'm finding myself more detached. It's funny when we decided to move to Tacoma, we didn't know anybody down here. And we were wondering, are we going to ever make any friends? But it's a
Yeah.
very friendly place. And we immediately became really good friends with all of our neighbors. Just everybody
Uh-huh.
that lives on the block, we became friends with. But there's not really any cartoonists, let alone cartoonists that are doing the type of work that I do that live here. It's funny, just a week ago, Seattle has an alternative comic event called Short Run, which they have every year. It's a 1-day fair,
Uh-huh.
free to the public, and it's all for alternative underground cartoonists. And I was invited to go, and I was like, nah, even though it's like not that far, it's
Right.
be a 40-minute drive, but I kept blowing it off. But then people who were coming from out of town, who were gonna be there kept writing to me saying, "You could be around? Are you gonna be coming to Short Run? Love to see you." And then all of a sudden it was like the day of, and I thought to myself, "There are people who actually want to see me." And and I'd rather would sit on my ass and stare at a computer screen or, rake leaves. So I just jumped in the car and went up there. And yeah, it was ridiculous how many people I knew there. So many familiar faces.
From Seattle or from out of town?
Yeah, well, of course, almost everybody who fits that description who lives in the Seattle area, but also people from way out of town.
Right.
Yeah, it was great. Glad I went.
That's cool.
It's an old age thing where you find yourself not even on purpose, but just getting detached and cut off.
Sure.
You know, you start to lose touch, and it's not a good idea to completely fall into that.
Well, do you think some of that's an age thing?
Well, yeah, sure. And you no longer, when you're younger, it's very important
Mhm.
to make these connections. You're trying to build a career, build a life, build a community. But after a while, it's like, been there, done that. It's
Right.
like, I don't need these people for anything. But it always is a really good idea to stay in touch.
I think so. I mean, as much as I kind of hate social media, it's also one of the things that I do appreciate about it.
Yeah, I know that there is, I'm not the first person to say it. Social media, though, Twitter and Facebook, there's something about when you go on there that a lot of people forget how to act like a civilized human being.
Yeah.
And they just start talking out of their asses and being way more nastier than they ever would in real life,
Sure.
you know?
Yeah.
And they're feeding off other people doing the same thing and just creates this impression that you're just like, "Oh my god, this person must hate me," or it seems to hate people that are like me, you know? But when they see you face to face, that almost immediately goes away, you know? They're not talking about killing you anymore.
It's
They
such a
they're just like,
tribal
"How it's going?"
place. Yeah.
Well, if they see that you're made of flesh and blood just like them, they forget.
Yeah.
It is the nature of communicating over the internet, it is inherently dehumanizing,
Yeah.
you know? You're just looking at words, you're just reading words and imbuing way too much in it.
I also think that people sometimes seem to forget that social media is not real life and they think they're in all kinds of contact with all kinds of people from in
Right.
front of their keyboard. And I'm like, you're actually not. You're actually not even having conversation. You're having a series of, monologues back and forth. And
Right. And it doesn't have to be that way. I feel like, again, this is just the people I know.
Mhm.
Everybody behaves much, much better than they did, say, back, when this all started, in the 90s and the aughts. But yeah, I guess that's just age. You live and learn, and it's like, oh, I shouldn't be promoting violence. But then there's the younger generation that seems to have to learn that all themselves all over again. It's not a good idea to publicly lose your shit about everything.
Right. Although I wonder if they're learning different lessons now because we grew up before there was this thing called, the World Wide Web and before there were cell phones and before there was email, and people today have never known a reality that wasn't completely embedded with these kinds of means of communication. And I just I wonder if they're actually learning completely different lessons in terms of how to interact with people.
Yeah, I was just, and I'm not saying anything that a million people aren't shattering on about, but I was just reading this article about how, especially post COVID, post
Mhm.
lockdown, and especially amongst young men, that for all kinds of reasons, they've really become shut ins, interact
Right.
face to face with other people at a bare minimum, pretty much live through their computer screen. So they talk about that being part of this loneliness epidemic, but
Yes.
they're so
Yes.
engaged and they're so busy and they're taking in so much that they don't perceive it as loneliness. They're not bored, they're not sad, there's a lot of engagement there.
They probably actually are sad and they don't know why.
Well, you and I'm sure we agree it's not, even if they're thoroughly engaged and are thoroughly entertained by being on their computer all day, not healthy,
No.
because you really do forget that these are other people, you forget what it's like to engage with, another meat sack like yourself.
I think it's critical. I think it's very important. I mean, I think one of the lessons of age that I've come to appreciate is when you are younger, you seem solely focused on quantity, how many friends you have, and how constantly engaged you are. And as we've gotten older, I still recognize the importance of real face-to-face human connection and conversation and all of that. But it's not about quantity anymore. Now it's about quality. So it's
Right.
easier to kind of filter through the 8,000 people and maybe weed it down to, 120 or something like that.
Right. Yes. As far as like being a shut in and being unwilling or unable to interact, though, I've always had a lot of friends, mostly male friends, who fit that description even before there was the internet. I guess
Huh.
now they would label them, on the spectrum, Asperger's, and they associate socializing with pain, sometimes maybe even physical pain. If you're weird, they're going to beat you up. So I've always known people who were shut ins, and there's a lot of that people in the world of comics.
I was just going to say, are these creative people mostly?
Yeah, yeah, creative people. I
Right.
probably not as much in the world of music, but that is only because music is inherently social. You go
Yeah.
to hear it and to play it. You go to clubs.
Yeah, and even in a band, being in a band is a social activity in and of itself.
Right,
It's a
right. But did you ever listen to that podcast, that history of rock and roll and 500 songs?
No, but it
Oh,
sounds
it's
like
really
something I'd be.
good. Yeah, it's really good. The host, he's this English guy who also sounds very Aspergery,
Oh, yeah.
but he just had, and I did not know this. Ever since they became famous, I've known and listened to Creedence Clearwater Revival.
Uh-huh.
But he was talking about John Fogerty, the leader of Creedence.
Yeah.
And the way he was describing it, it's like Fogerty was like on the spectrum. Even after they became really famous, he couldn't look at the audience. He
Oh,
would not
really?
make eye contact with the audience.
Huh.
He had a lot of social issues. There were a lot of things wrong with him,
Right,
even with
right.
his own bandmates. He was so difficult and so stuck in his ways. And it's like, holy cow, who would have ever thought the leader of Credence, was on the spectrum?
What do you think that is about? I don't know if I want to call it mental illness, because I don't know that being on the spectrum is actually an illness, but it's definitely
Right.
it's a divergence.
Well, it's an explanation. Yeah,
Right.
it is, again, like, talking about young men, so many of these things, ADHD and, hyperactivity and Asperger's, it in many ways, it seems like it's pathologizing boyhood and
Uh-huh.
manhood, like, but it does explain a lot.
So many creative people seem to have things that are sort of, I guess the word now is neurodivergent, or,
Right.
depression or anxiety. You see that a lot with people that are also particularly creative, which I've always been kind of fascinated by.
Yes, but it is a good, having these labels can
Uh-huh.
be good because it explains, and then everybody else is less inclined to try to pressure that person, whether it's a
Uh-huh.
male or female, into not being that way. I mean, it used
Right.
to get beaten out of you, being a weirdo or a nerd, but now people are much more forgiving of it, which it has got to be healthier to some degree.
Oh,
It
sure.
allows people to be more themselves.
What's more understood too.
Yes,
Growing up, you didn't really talk a whole lot about depression or anxiety or bipolar or ADHD, and a lot of these things didn't even have names for them yet.
right,
Like
right.
there was, growing up, there was no such thing as being on the spectrum. What is that?
Yeah. I remember when I was around the time I was graduating high school, I was at a friend's house. It was just the two of us, not like my best friend, but a good longtime friend. And he, from out of nowhere, he just looked at me and he said, "Pete, I'm really depressed." And this is like 1975 when I graduated high school. And I never had somebody say that to me like that. Just go, "I'm really depressed." And I went, and I was alarmed. I said, "Why? Like, what happened?" I immediately thought, did somebody die? That
Right.
there had to be a concrete reason
That it was
why.
circumstantial.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. What bad thing happened that made you sad right now?
Right. Right.
And but I could tell at the same time too, he was talking in general. It's not like this is something that's gonna go away. I'm gonna wake up tomorrow and next week and still be depressed. Looking back, it's like, did I say something wrong? I didn't pick on him. But,
Right.
yeah, that was my immediate response, is like, "Tell me what bad thing happened."
Yeah.
Your dog died, what bad thing happened? But he just shut down, you
Hmm.
know?
Because he was depressed.
Yeah, well, I found out much later, that, he came out that he was gay, and I
Okay.
have no idea that considering how people felt about homosexuality back then, that could have been why he was
Oh, sure.
depressed. Because
Could be a big part.
with me and my whole circle of our whole circle of friends, nobody knew. None of us had a clue,
Right.
so that might have been it. I don't know, or maybe it wasn't. Who knows? But when I did find out that he came out, I was like, I wonder if that's what he wanted to tell me, and I
Uh-huh.
just seemed
Uh-huh.
like too much of a knucklehead
Right.
for him to feel comfortable telling me.
Well, it must have been a liberation when he finally did.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure.
My mom has a story because my mom suffered from pretty severe depression, as I have a lot of my life. But my mom said, I remember the day that I realized my mother would never, my grandmother would never understand my depression. And my mom tried to explain her depression, and her mom's response was, "Oh, go buy a dress. Whenever I'm feeling blue, I go buy a dress and it makes everything feel better." And I was like, "Oh man, that's just
That's a
so."
recipe for going broke, buying dresses.
And that, especially if you're
Yeah.
depressed, right?
If you're enjoying this conversation, please make sure you hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please like this video, leave a comment, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. It's the quickest way to grow our channel, and it's absolutely free. You can also subscribe to our other channels on social media. Check out our Instagram at Creative Asylum CA, that's the letter CA, or on TikTok at The Creative Asylum, that's all one word. Our website is thecapod.com, and our Facebook profile is the same, facebook.com/thecapod. All right, back to the episode.
Were you already drawing in high school? I assume you probably were.
Yeah, yeah, doodling, just trying to amuse my friends. I used
Uh-huh.
to draw me and my friends. My brother was like a real natural cartoonist, so I would do
Okay.
comics just to keep up with him and to imitate him.
What was the point at which you started drawing comics? Like actual what was that point for you?
Oh, as long as I can remember, as long
Okay.
as my brother since we were 7, 8, something like that, he would just copy what we saw in the funny papers or Mad Magazine. I wish that I knuckled down and tried harder to work on my craft, so to speak, at an earlier age. I didn't really take it seriously, and there was like no encouragement from anybody. That was, it's not that my brother and I got yelled at for drawing comics, but my parents sure didn't see that as a career path of any kind.
When are you gonna get serious with your life, that kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah, you need a real job, or if you have an artistic inclination, do something else with it. Be an architect. I come from a family of architects actually,
Okay, okay.
and or even like when I would take art classes in high school, and then later when I did go to art school,
Uh-huh,
comics were just so back then they were so looked down upon. They were not considered art at all. They
uh-huh,
were just garbage. When I started art school at School of Visual Arts, I was a favorite pupil of my drawing teacher.
uh-huh.
I had him for a couple of classes and really liked my work. He was very encouraging, and he was very much of the fine art bent,
Right.
not like you did abstract work, but he considered his work art with a capital A.
Yes.
And when I told him, he might have asked me, "What do you want to do, in the future?" And I said, "Well, I'm really into comics, and I want to be a cartoonist." And when I told him that, he just spun around on his heels and walked away and never talked to me again.
For real?
Yes.
Maybe a better question is not when you started drawing comics. Maybe the question is, at what point did you start writing your own stories and your own narrative and, like, doing comics as, like, this is I have new stories and new characters that I'm creating?
That would have been well, again, like I told you, I was, still in grade school, middle school, high school when I
Yeah.
became familiar with underground comics. But where I grew up, where I lived, it was like the far edges of the suburbs. There was no place that I can go and buy underground
Right.
comics. And so then I started in 1977, I started going to art school in New York City. And right across the street from my art school, it was a record store, but the record store had a spin rack, and the spin rack was all underground comics.
Oh, cool.
Over time, over the next few months, I bought every single comic on that spin rack, and it was mainly Crumb. I just bought everything that Crumb did, but also other artists. Aileen Crumb, Bill Griffith, the Zippy the Pinhead guy, loved his stuff.
Zippy's great stuff.
Yes, there's another cartoonist named Robert Armstrong who did Mickey Rat. I don't know if you remember
Yes.
that at all. Loved it.
I actually have 2 trunks full of underground comics.
Oh, there you go.
I started collecting as a kid, and I mean, I stopped collecting probably somewhere in the '90s, but I still think it's in terms of comic books, I think it's still
Right,
one of the greatest. Yeah, I mean, there's just so much. There's so much.
right.
Kim Deitch is another one that I was always a big fan of.
Sure, yeah, he is another one. He's another one of my all-time favorites. And, now that I was doing a deep dive into the world of underground comics, that was when I decided this is what I want to do. I can remember at the time when I started buying all these en masse, buying these underground comics, I was 19, and it was when I turned 20. On my 20th birthday, I said, "This is what I'm going to do. This is my vow. I'm going to be one of these guys."
I love it.
Yeah, and again, I love those comics so much that I just thought, if I'm loving them so much, everybody must love them. All of these people must be rich. Turns out none of them were. But it's like, all right, well, yeah, I already started down this path. Over time, I met a lot of artists, not just people I knew right in the city, but all over the country. Like
Mhm,
uh, Gary Panter, Matt Groening, Charles Burns, who and they lived all over the place, but they were just like me. It was like, was weaned on these underground comics, and it's underground comics made a lot of money, like in the late '60s, early '70s. But
right.
then all legal decisions, I don't know, the cost of paper, all these things conspired to mostly drive them out of business. It no longer was a viable way to make a living. But still, everybody who grew up reading them still wanted to do them. So there was this new
Yeah.
mass of young cartoonists. What was very interesting back then, too, is you would look at what Matt Groening or Linda Barry was doing, and then Charles Burns and Gary Panter
Mhm,
and Drew Friedman and Kaz, and everybody was self-publishing. And their style, not just the styles, but the format they chose to work in, whether it was like a little mini comic
mhm.
or something really big.
Like
Every
Raw.
everybody's approach was totally different. When I marvel more at that than anything. Now, if I when I go to like going to Short Run or any comic convention, you'll see a lot of good skilled work. There's always
Mhm,
talented people, but I always compared to back then, there's a certain sameness. I see a certain sameness, both the approach, what they're writing about, how they write about it, the drawing style, even a bit. There'll be the certain way, and they don't even perceive it that way. They think they're being totally free, but I'm seeing the sameness. Whereas when you think of all those artists I just named, you couldn't come up with a more divergent group of
yes,
art, style
yes.
wise, everything wise. They were wildly different. And that's something I miss too. Is this? But it's also because they were all so out on their own. Nobody knew what is the right format. It's like, oh
I have
well,
a
this
question for
works.
you about that.
Yeah.
Do you think that perhaps some of that has to do with the World Wide Web? In other words, pre-World Wide Web, it's the Wild West. You have more fanzine kind of culture. You have
Right.
like independent record labels are
Sure.
so distinct to their specific regional scene.
Right. You had to physically go to the store that sold them.
Right, but also the World Wide Web gives you access to everything everybody else is doing, and so now that sort of regionality becomes, more diffuse, and I think that,
Right.
like, once you have the World Wide Web, everybody can see everybody else's art, and maybe
Right.
it starts to become, I don't know, homogenous isn't the right word, but maybe influences start to kind of bleed back and forth where people are starting to become more samey in some regard.
Right. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
yeah, no, I would agree. And two other factors too is one is technology, and this
Mhm.
isn't necessarily true amongst alternative artists, but with more mainstreamy artists, when I notice, how slick, for lack of a better word, how more
Uh-huh.
polished all these young people's work looks, I forget how much they draw online and how easy it is to swipe, not draw online, draw on, tablets and Photoshop. Just use all these things that just make it so much. It's not pen and ink. There's
Right.
no paper, there's no pen, there's no ink. It's all on the computer, but it makes it so much slicker looking.
Sure.
And also it's much easier for everybody to kind of fall into this samey look.
Mhm.
It's like, well, this is what that guy's doing looks good, and I can see how he's doing it. He's using these tools,
I
these
can do
online
that.
tools, so I'm gonna do it.
Right.
Another factor is the world of art. It's always been very, the dominant outlook tends to be this is true of young people in general, but the predominant outlook is left-leaning. Politically, everybody's of the
Uh-huh.
left.
Uh-huh.
But the left became, undeniably a bit punishing of anybody who didn't fall right in line,
Uh-huh.
and so I sense this fear. The whole idea is to be honest and tell your truth, but I see people putting on the brakes because they don't want to become a pariah. It's just become so much easier in the an artistic world. You could so quickly become a pariah if it's like, "Oh, yeah, tell your truth," but that's too much truth.
Too much truth?
That's those are wrong truths. Those aren't truths, you know?
Are you referring to cancel culture sort of broadly?
Yeah.
Right.
All that stuff, or the fear of it. I started sensing this even in, like, in the late '90s, yeah,
Mhm.
which I guess coincides with the rise of the internet, but, I started seeing this, timidity, like lots of pussyfooting, and whereas there
Right.
used to be I've been digging through a lot of my old a lot of these old, zines and comics, all this self-published stuff from the '80s, early '90s. If somebody drew this stuff, wrote this stuff, and put it on the line now, they'd be nuked, even though
Yeah.
they were
Yeah.
insane. You couldn't be more politically incorrect. The stuff was just completely insane, and it was to be that insane was sort of a norm, you know? And then it became everybody got very soft. And it doesn't mean like by being soft and sensitive that the work is inherently bad, but it generally very much became the case, you know?
Like, careful. Everybody's too careful.
Yes, yes.
I mean, can you imagine Robert Crumb doing the kind of stuff he was doing in 1969?
No, here's the thing is like last time I saw him, of course he's attributing in part to age, but he says finally, he was here I am in my 70s and he goes, my libido has finally died down. He goes, I'm finally able to get off of this wild horse. And that combined with the whole Me Too movement made him it filled him with shame. He's like, I
Uh-huh.
can't believe all this shit I used to draw. I can't believe this
Oh,
stuff. What the
interesting.
hell is wrong? He goes, I feel so sad for women that they have to live on a planet that's like me. It was like to the point where I was like, Robert, you're not that bad. Calm down. But he was talking about himself in his past work like he was some kind of a war criminal, you
Well,
know?
he's certainly been beaten up an awful lot.
They used to not be able to make him stop, but now he's making himself stop, you know?
I just had a conversation the other day about an upcoming guest that I'm going to be having on this platform, whatever you want to call it. I'm trying to avoid using the word podcast, and I don't know why. Because it's somebody who has had some very definite allegations of sexual impropriety. And I'll just hold off on the name at this point. But somebody I've appreciated from a creative standpoint for a very, very long time and still do. And, when I first heard these allegations, I was troubled a little bit and I found it upsetting. But I also have these really strong feelings about that sort of binary purity testing cancel culture that so many people engage in, that if you do the smallest little thing wrong, that you're judged in terms of the entirety of who you are, with the
Right,
assumption that you're every person needs to be held to a standard that is perhaps, unrealistic, and also being held to every last thing you ever said and did, without any willingness to consider that people can change and evolve over time.
right,
And so I've made the decision. I'm going to have a conversation. It's going to be an episode, and I know I'm going to get a lot of blowback for it.
right,
I'm just gonna say, "And fine." I mean, like, it bothers me that, I'm pretty sure everything that Woody Allen has been accused of, he probably did.
right. Well, the person that you're talking about, is it all allegations or is it a fact that he was a naughty boy
I don't know. I don't know
or
if
something?
I don't know if we're gonna have that conversation or not, but I'm gonna probably ask him. It's like, "Do you
Yeah.
wanna talk about this?" Like, "We can,"
And is
like,
this stuff that happened a long time ago, or
I'm
is
not
it more
I
recent?
think it's a little more recent. But it doesn't change the fact that he's an incredibly talented musician.
Right.
And getting back to the Woody Allen thing, it's like, it's very disappointing to, I mean, I think at this point it's pretty much settled that the things he's been accused of, he pretty much did, most of them.
Really? Oh, I don't think so, but I
No?
don't wanna go there.
Okay. Well, but, I mean,
I
I
mean,
s I
a lot of it was ill-advised,
I
but I
saw
don't
the
think
I
the
saw the
worst is the
HBO thing, and I went into it going, "All right, we'll see," and by the end, I was like, "I'm convinced." But I
uh,
guess the point is, it doesn't change the fact for me that, like, I still have a deep admiration for who he is as an artist and a filmmaker. I'm still gonna listen to Ike and Tina Turner even though I think that, Ike was horrible.
I met a woman who, and this was after he became deservedly a pariah. It was after, Tina Turner wrote her autobiography. An acquaintance of mine worked as Ike Turner's assistant.
Oh, wow.
She told me some really funny stories. He was old by then. I said, "Was he out of line with you?" She goes, "No, no." She goes, this was like late 90s, early aughts.
Uh-huh.
He wasn't out of line with anybody. He was old.
Right.
Um, Two funny stories. I hope you don't mind me telling these stories.
Go
Two
ahead.
funny she told me was they were out having dinner
Mhm.
and somewhere, a woman goes by but she passes their table, and the woman looks at him. She goes, "Excuse me, are you like Turner?" And he goes, "Why, yes, I am." And she slaps him in the face and marches off.
Really?
And my friend is like thinking, "Okay, well, this has got to be something that happens every day." But I think Turner turns to her and goes, "What was that all about?" He was like in total denial.
Really? That's
Yeah. The other funny, just as a gross story, but I told us while I'm thinking of it up here, I'll ruin the whole show telling you this. He, um, he would only, man of the South, Memphis guy, he would only eat Southern food, deep fried Southern food.
really? Okay.
And that's all. And just if she was with him, if she was from the South too, she had a taste for that stuff, but it's not healthy.
Right.
And she was like traveling with him, and he would order. I'll pay, but we're gonna eat where I want to and what I want to. So she says it caused problems. There was like, I don't know if you ever ate food like that all the time. It starts leaking out of you, like this orange goop starts leaking out. And so she said to him, "Look, no more of that. No more of that soul food. I gotta take a break. I need a break." And he went, "Oh, what's the matter, baby? You got a leakage?" And she goes,
Oh.
"Yeah, I got leakage." She goes, "Don't worry. I got the solution for that. Do not worry." And she goes, "What?" And she goes, "I'll tell you." So they go out to eat. Again, he picked the place. And
Uh-huh.
she's like, is he going to give me like some pills or something, some medicine? So
Right.
she says, "What's the solution to the leakage problem?" And he handed her panty liners.
Oh, geez.
It's like,
So
keep on leaking. Just
so so he
have some diapers.
so he was still kind of awful even in old age,
In a different
basically.
way.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I hope he paid her well.
Yeah. Well, she didn't have that job long.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
she wound up with some funny stories.
Wow. If not icky stories, I guess, right?
Yeah, yeah. Now I totally ruined the show
No, no,
with a
it's
little scatological humor.
we get to go wherever we want to. We get to go wherever the conversation takes us. I do think that's an interesting conversation broadly, just about purity tests and cancel culture, and I do have a certain amount of issue with it. And I understand where a lot of it comes from in the very most well meant way. But I have to imagine that there's many things I've done or said in my past that maybe at the time I wasn't even aware of, or things I might have done or said that might have impacted people negatively, and maybe I don't even know about it.
Right,
I also like to believe that I'm a much more evolved version of myself than I was, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago.
right. Sure. Well,
Presumably, right?
yeah. But the other thing too is like a lot of people who eagerly do the canceling, who make it their full-time job, is going on social
Sure.
media and
I
looking
know
for
it's true.
misdeeds. It's not coming from a good place. They're being
No.
cruel. They want to punish. It's all about destroying other people's livelihoods. So it's just like here we're like saying, "Oh, I didn't said some things back in the day. I wish I didn't, but I learned." And maybe some people who didn't said this and that deserve to have been canceled. In the future, the people who will be doing the most groveling are these punishers.
Mhm,
You
mhm.
know, first of all, it always comes around. You know,
Right.
and if you're the one that's always looking for people to punish and going around casting blame, you better have your ass covered really and you can't because there's always something that you've done. Nobody's perfect.
Right.
And that happens all the time. And especially if you're somebody that's always pointing fingers, when you screw up, you're going to have a million people with their knives out.
Because of the
Nobody's
hypocrisy of it all, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've noticed people who've been caught in that situation, they really go into defense mode, at least at
Mhm.
first. But over time, it's like, "Oh, Jesus Christ, what was I thinking? What was I
Yeah.
doing?"
I don't know. I
You
just
know?
think sometimes life is too short, and I'm not to the listeners of this program, I'm not, I'm not making this binary thing like people shouldn't be judged for the things they do. But can we have a little bit of middle ground? Can we have a little bit of compassion, or
Yeah.
can we at least have some fucking dialogue? If nothing else, right? And also when it comes to like art, be it like music, be it fine art, be it cartoons. I tend to like work that is more confrontational, sometimes combative, sometimes something that kind of makes you squirm and feel uncomfortable because I
Right.
think those are the places where you're actually forced to ponder more, to think more. I think it actually makes us smarter people to a large degree.
Right, right. And it's also, just speaking for myself, it's more entertaining
It is more entertaining
when
too. Yes.
when you're
Yes.
pushing boundaries like that. It's
Absolutely.
generally
There's no
not
question.
pushing boundaries for its own sake, but just to not hold back.
Well, I think that I mean the whole nature of art in my mind is to disrupt. I don't want to read Archie if I can read The Dark Knight. Well, speaking of, okay, this is the most awkward transition I've ever done. But I was I was fascinated by the fact that post hate you've done a whole lot of work for publishers that maybe in your earlier life you never would have imagined. That you've actually done stuff with DC and with Marvel
Right.
and with publishers like Dark Horse, and maybe that's not as much of a departure. But I think that's
Yeah.
really I think that's super cool that you've had all this opportunity.
Yeah. Well, I'm not with Marvel and DC specifically, it was right around the time I decided to take a break from doing hate because I was taking up all of my time.
Uh-huh.
And so I was very much open to trying different things. I was casting about, trying to figure out what to do. And Marvel and DC called me up. And at the time, they were doing terrible. Business was really bad. And they would reach this point where it's like, let's just throw shit at the wall and see what sticks. And it's not just me, but other alternative-ish cartoonists.
Uh-huh.
They started letting us try our hand at things, and just because they felt like they had nothing to lose. Unfortunately, right around the time that I started doing that, started doing different things for both of the big two, the superhero movies suddenly became the thing. It
Right.
exploded. So now money was rolling in. They didn't have to start experimenting and
Yeah.
mucking about with people like me. And they mostly zeroed back in on doing, what made them famous. Superheroes,
Sure.
milking the existing brands, Hulk and all of them as much as possible, and new stuff like that. Because it attracted a lot of fans, but the new fans were superhero fans, mainstream comic fans, which I personally never cared for. Even as a kid, I never was crazy about. I like the artwork of Jack Kirby, and that was the extent of it.
I love Kirby. I love Ditko.
Was never crazy about it. I still am.
Really.
Ditko's work leaves me cold, which I'm missing something because a lot of my best friends just think he's the
I love
best,
Ditko.
the
How
absolute
about Jim
best.
Steranko? Were you ever into Jim Steranko?
A bit, but it really, it's like it's kind of all of them. It just started and ended with Kirby.
Yeah. Uh,
He was the one where his artwork just jumped off the page.
It was unlike anything else. It was unlike anything anybody else was doing.
Otherwise, and for the most part, I can't really tell.
Uh-huh.
I mean, of course, I could spot Ditko, but with almost all the other mainstream superhero comics, I can't tell who's drawing what. To me, it's speaking of samey.
Yeah.
You could tell if it's 80s, 90s, aughts, but still, anybody who's working at that time, they're all kind of drawing the same way.
I think that's what started being fun about independent comics as like not underground, but a lot of the independent publishers that started to happen in, I guess, what, the
Yeah.
80s, 90s, is that suddenly again, you kind of had people that sort of had the DNA from mainstream comics, like that's where they'd grown up. But artistically, I felt that there was more artists really starting to sort of do work that was really distinctive. People like Howard
Right.
Chaykin or Frank Miller or
And the Hernandez brothers.
and the oh yeah, I mean, and you got to work with what, Gilbert Hernandez?
Yeah, yeah, we worked on a DC title.
I was such a just huge fan of Love and Rockets and all the Hernandez brothers stuff is
Yeah.
what was that like working with Gilbert?
It was good. That was like it was like an all ages comic. We only did
Uh-huh,
9 issues of it.
uh-huh,
It was difficult for him because he was the sole artist on it, and we had to come out with a new issue every month.
uh-huh.
So it was pretty much was taking he did it for the money, but it was
Sure.
taking up all of his time, and he wanted to do Love and
Right,
Rockets.
right.
It's kind of taken away from Love and Rockets. So when, DC pulled the plug on it, he didn't miss it.
He was secretly happy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
or even not so secretly. It was as a writer, it wasn't taking up quite as much of my time,
right,
I guess. And I still had a lot of ideas for it. They canceled it for a good reason. It wasn't a huge hit. They weren't making
right.
money on it. But I still have plenty of ideas for that title.
I think of the record label comparison. It's like, well, you've got your artists that are selling a lot of records and the ones that aren't, you probably drop the ones that aren't, right?
Yes. Well, sure.
So we are getting to the end of our time here before,
Okay.
so I should probably wrap things up with you. I have one question that I'm very curious about, and then we'll sort of finish with a final question. The thing I'm really curious about is it's my understanding that Hate almost became like an animated series on more than one occasion.
Yeah, it's been in development, as they say. It's been optioned and developed several times, kind of
Okay.
half dozen times. But yeah, it never, it never got greenlit. Never made that final jump.
Why is it that it's never happened? Because I think there's a huge world out there that would love it.
Well, it's like when you get a development deal with somebody, whoever it is.
Mhm.
I tend to be deals with Fox and MTV and I don't know who else, but there's so many shows that get optioned,
Right.
and so you're squeezing into this funnel, and only there's only certain things that are going to come out the other end. So it really isn't surprising that I never made it all the way through the funnel. I know people who just sold countless ideas and never got anything on the screen. So it's just the way it is. But I made a lot of good money in what I call the business of not making TV shows.
Uh-huh.
The development deals can be pretty lucrative. So,
Right.
and sometimes I think maybe it was a blessing that none of them went all the way through. Because what if I wasn't happy with the final product?
Yeah. Ask Matt Groening about that. I think,
Yeah,
I'm sure
I think he's happy with the final product.
I
He never told me otherwise.
I would hope so. I would hope so.
Yeah.
It's part of the cultural iconography,
Yes. Yeah.
It's pretty amazing. So, I think it's delightful that you followed your passion and followed the thing you wanted to do and, through the course of doing it have been able to be successful, probably beyond where you ever imagined when you first started.
Yeah, yeah, and that, kept making a decent living at it for many decades now. So yeah, no complaints. Got no complaints.
So, what is it that gets you up every day to go to
Well,
your your
I'm
your job?
officially retired. I'm on the
Okay.
dole, but and I thought, I'm not going to draw anymore. But I still find myself doing comics. I started eBaying like crazy. It's like now is my chance to clear out my garage, just get rid of
Yes.
tons of stuff.
Right.
But even eBaying, it didn't take up all my time. It still spent a lot. I found myself just twiddling my thumb and staring at the walls. So I still draw comics. I'm still doing comics. I revisited Hate. I recently did some new Hate comics, and I just did another little one-shot comic. So, and I do a lot of stuff for a publication called Reason. They keep me busy. So, yeah, I still am drawing all the time. Go figure.
I mean, can you imagine a life where you weren't drawing?
Well, I was. I thought I didn't want to draw anymore, but here it's weird. It's a habit. The
Uh-huh.
analogy I keep coming up with is I heard about like somewhere in the Middle East. I guess it's a common phenomenon. they train a donkey to walk around a well because they need the water.
Uh-huh.
And there's a mechanism where as long as the donkey who is strapped to this pole keeps going around, it brings the water up and it keeps fertilizing the crops, the farm. And it does that for years. After a while, the donkey, of course, its knees and feet start to go like we all do, and it can't keep doing that. So they'll finally, they put it out to pasture. They just take it, unhook it from its gizmo, and say, there you go. You don't have to do this anymore. It's still, even though it doesn't have to do it, it still keeps walking in a circle. So I'm that donkey.
Okay.
I can't stop walking in a circle.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Creative Asylum. A quick favor before you go. If you liked this conversation, please be sure to follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every Tuesday at 10. You can find us on Instagram and on YouTube at Creative Asylum CA. That's Creative Asylum and the letters CA. Our website is thecapod.com. And our Facebook is the same, facebook.com/thecapod. Until next week, when we'll have a new conversation with another creative disruptor, stay creative in life and at work.